They're quite the readings this morning, aren't they? As we were reading the psalm there, I could feel the energy, I could feel the life going out of the room, so I thought I'd better speed things up and get to the sermon to rescue you all. You know, there's a simple way that I could preach this sermon. I could talk about the talents, and I could say that God has given all of you many wonderful gifts, and go out there and make the best of those gifts and those talents and use them to improve yourself and use them to improve the world around you. And don't worry, God will bless you and multiply you and give you the increase. I could say that and be done with that story, and that would fit in with the readings we've had in the past few weeks about personal responsibility. I could also just simply ignore the first reading from Zephaniah, which a lot of preachers might do. God's wrath is seldom anything anybody wants to hear about, unless you think otherwise during the Old Testament. No one wanted to hear about it then either, which is why they killed the prophets. The prophets that they let live were the court prophets, the ones who would pay for, the king would pay them to preach for hire, and they only ever said flattering things. So the wrath of God, the judgment of God, has never been a popular topic, but let's see what we can do with it. Have you ever received a gift that didn't satisfy you? Have you ever gotten a gift like that, one that just didn't do anything for you? I know you all have, and I've certainly gotten those too. I think one of the reasons that we don't like some of the gifts that we receive is that the person who was giving them to us didn't put any thought into those gifts. You get a gift from someone and you say, does this person even know who I am? And if you've known that person for 30 years, that could even be more insulting when you get that kind of gift. Maybe you feel this is just this person re-gifting the gift from last Christmas. So some of those gifts that we receive that don't satisfy us simply reveal a lack of trying, a lack of thoughtfulness on the part of the giver. But I suspect, and what I think today's gospel is all about, is that there's also another type of gift that many of us have received. And unlike showing what is lacking in the giver, those gifts show what is lacking in the receiver, in us. You know, somebody might come up to you and say, here, I think you really need this, and maybe it's, a tasteful tie instead of that garish one you've been wearing. Shows the lack of taste that you yourself have. Grace is that kind of second gift. Grace is a gift from God that reveals what is lacking in us, lacking in the receiver. Today's texts, both the one from Zephaniah and the one from Matthew, are talking about God's judgment and God's punishment, both punishment and judgment of each of us individually, but also judgment and punishment on the whole world. And this is a simple message that is presented in both of these readings, particularly in the gospel. It's a simple message that's hard to grasp, but it's the heart of the gospel. It's the heart of nearly every sermon you'll ever hear from this pulpit, at least while I'm in it. The gospel is this: you owe a debt to God that you cannot pay, and you can either put your life and you can either put your faith in the substitute, in the payment that is offered on your behalf, which is Jesus Christ, or you can forfeit your life. And the words in Matthew with which this parable ends, Matthew 25, verse 29, underscore the fact that if you don't put your faith in the substitute, then you will lose everything. From those who have nothing, which is to say no faith even at all, even what they have will be taken away. You see, what this gospel is telling us is that while each of us has a debt to pay, God gives us the means to pay that debt. While each of us is facing punishment, God gives us the means to escape that punishment. And he gives us the means through a special kind of gift called grace. Each of the talents here, I think, represents God's grace. And notice that it's given according to what the gospel says is ability. I might reinterpret that to say need. So the slave who got 5 talents needed a full measure of God's grace. 2 talents, a little less. The 1 talent, maybe this slave actually had more going for him than the first 2, and so didn't need as much. But it was a gift he didn't know what to do with. It was a gift that didn't satisfy him. So he goes and he buries the talent. Now, a talent isn't like a penny or a nickel here. A talent was representative in those days of about 15 to 16 years worth of wages. So it took a lot of effort on this slave's part to actually go out there and dig a hole deep enough to hold that much gold. It certainly would have been a lot less effort on his part to go to the bank and put it on deposit. So it shows you the contempt that this slave had for this gift. The master returns in the story. The slave forfeits his talent, and he is banished. It was certainly the intent of the master that this talent be put to good use. It was certainly the intent that it be multiplied, but this slave refuses to do so. As I said, I think this parable is meant to be an illustration of how God provides the means to satisfy his wrath, which we read about in Zephaniah in very graphic detail. But there's another place where God supplies the means. Can you think about that? Can you think where God provides the substitute, where God provides the gift that will be offered? It's the famous story of the sacrifice of Isaac, when Abraham takes his son at the word of God up to the mountain to sacrifice him on an altar. And you can sit here and you can say, what kind of horrible God would do that? All of you who are fathers would certainly recoil at the thought of killing your son. And that story is often simply presented as a test of Abraham's faith, which of course he passes. But the real meaning behind that story is that what does God do? God provides the substitute. God provides the ram in the thicket, which is then sacrificed on that altar. Now, if Abraham had said, no, I'm not going to accept that gift, I'm going to sacrifice my son instead, we would truly have a barbarous religion on our hands. But we don't have that. We have a God who has supplied the substitute, the ram, and what Abraham did was show his faith in that gift. He put his faith in the substitute and in the ram, and so the sacrifice proceeded without the death of Isaac. Two of the slaves in this story do the same thing. They put their faith in these talents that God has given them, and God multiplies these talents. But the other slave does not put his faith in this talent. Perhaps because he didn't think it was enough. Maybe he wondered why the others got more. Maybe it was because he didn't want to face and take responsibility for his own actions, for his own sins, which this talent was meant to be the substitute for, the atonement for. But here's the thing. If you don't accept the substitute, if you can't put your faith in the ram, you will end up becoming the sacrifice, which is exactly what happens to this one. His talent is taken from him, and he is thrown out into outer darkness. And so we have to, as believers, we have to accept the gifts that God gives us, and we have to put them to good use for ourselves and for each other, trusting that God will multiply and give us the increase. Now, as I said, I began this sermon with an illustration that a lot of us, all of us, have received gifts that may not interest us too much, that we don't really like. And I suspect that when you first hear it, sometimes the story of God's grace is a gift that doesn't interest you that much, because after all, what are you going to do with it? How is it practical? How is it useful? You know, if you're given a good voice, or you're given the ability to run, or some sort of athleticism, or you can write, or you can speak in public, these are talents and abilities that people will pay you for. These are talents and abilities that people will cheer you for and give you the laurel wreath for. And maybe if you're a Christian, or you're just a good person who's been brought up well, you'll give thanks to God for the wonderful things he's given you, all of these good things that make you so likable. But the free gift of salvation does not always seem that satisfying. Some of you will get it, the converted. Others may regard it as license to simply do whatever. After all, I began this sermon with saying that the whole idea of judgment is a bit out of date. So maybe this God who judges isn't really real anyway. So why do I need grace to pay this debt? Still, others might feel cheated of the earthly talents and success that other people have. And so God's grace simply sounds like a rain check to them. Oh, you're not as well off as the rest of them, as these other people, but just have faith. It'll get better when you die. We want something that satisfies us in the here and now. But I think, and as I've been preaching to you now for several weeks, Jesus makes it clear why this gift of grace is both in our long-term interest, meaning heaven, but also effective here and now. This gospel passage speaks to the cross at verse 19. This gospel passage says, "After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them," which, of course, is what the cross is. It's the settlement of our account with God, but we're not the ones on that cross. We're not the ones who had to be sacrificed. The account is settled by the sacrifice that God himself provides. It's settled by the gift that God himself provides. That's what the word victim means. Victim is the gift that is put on the altar. We don't think much about sacrifice these days. We don't think about that because our religion has put an end to it, right? We don't have a system of animal sacrifices in Christianity, and certainly we don't have a system of human sacrifices. But the echo of what a sacrifice really is, the echo of the fact that it involved priests with knives killing things, is right there in that altar that we still call an altar. But now it's a memorial. It's not a living altar. It's not an altar where there's blood on it. It's a memorial to the sacrifice that finished that bloody regime once and for all, and where our accounts were settled with God, where the wrath of God came to an end. God gives us this gift, which may not seem like very much, the gift of his Son, Jesus Christ, to satisfy our debt to sin. And so when we accept that gift, that substitute, that grace, we are accepting the gift that we need the most, even if we may not realize it. What can we do with this gift? What can we do with it? Well, when we put our faith in the divine substitute, we show what is lacking in us. The divine substitute is meant to pay the debt that is incurred by our moral failings and our shortcomings. We can't pay those debts with silver and gold, but we can pay them through faith. We can acknowledge then what is wrong and missing in us. And those of us who pray those words of confession sincerely every Sunday are doing the work, the heart work that it takes to become more human, to acknowledge that you have shortcomings and failings, and that your moral debt is paid. Your own life will become more satisfying once you grasp that, once you realize that it isn't all up to you, once you realize that your failings and shortcomings are real and other people have been harmed and hurt by them. Once you become the kind of person who asks for and receives forgiveness, you find yourself at peace, not only in your own heart and soul with yourself, but at peace with God. And you begin to become at peace with the world around you. Because after all those people who have wronged you are in the same position as you are. Why hold them accountable? Why hold on to your grudge when God has already let go of his grudge? Another benefit of this is that the moral mistakes, the moral failings that led you to go into debt with God in the first place, you become less prone to them. You become less prone to them when you realize that they have been forgiven and that debt has been paid, and you are more aware of the guilt that was yours, but the substitute who has paid your debt. That gives way, our guilt and fear give way to assurance and hope. Assurance and hope make us more patient and forbearing with each other. So you see how this gift multiplies and increases as the more you put your faith in it, the more you go deeper into it, the more you begin to understand it. And all of this because you receive a gift from God that you probably didn't even realize you needed.